Welcome back to this week's episode of Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. I'm your host, Ron Campbell, and this week, as with every week, I want to start off by reminding you of the most important truth in the entire universe. God loves you. Now, we've started the next phase of our journey, and we're going from the lifelessness here on our little planet to life, where we find ourselves today. And the question that we have to ask ourselves is, how could we get there? How is it possible for us to go from lifelessness to life? And before we do, there's a couple of questions I want to answer along the way, because I think too often we kind of get sold a bill of goods that isn't really true. And it's not necessarily anybody's fault. It's how the picture is painted for us. But lifelessness means something very specific. It doesn't mean, a lot of times we have this image painted of a pool of primordial soup, but a lot of the time, you have this pool of primordial soup and it's surrounded by a jungle or something else like that. And we kind of forget that lifelessness means at this point in Earth's existence, you have rocks and you have water, and that's about it. You don't have much of anything else. Obviously, there's more than just rocks. Obviously, there's all sorts of elements and things like that also exist. But it's not like, well, you have mud and you have various, microorganisms. You have nothing, literally nothing. And so a lot of times we start in the wrong place when we talk about lifelessness. But before we even get to that, I want to talk this week about the definition of evolution, because what we're going to find along the way is one of the things that trips us up, I think, is that we don't understand exactly what we're talking about in terms of evolution. We allow for something very easy to occur, and it does, and we assume that, well, if that can occur, then something else can occur, and that's not always a valid assumption. When we look at life around us, one of the things that biologists will tell us is that the complexity of life is overwhelming. And that's going to be for multiple different things. The information contained in DNA, the enormous complexity of the cells that make up us, just the functionality of things like, everything. When you look at a bird, everything that makes a bird fly, it's just so enormously complex, everything that has to come together for a bird to be able to fly. When you look at all of these things, there's one of two possibilities. Either life is incredibly complex, so enormously complex that it is the absolute positive 100% giant fingerprint of design that we look at and we should look at and go, oh my goodness, we have to be the result of an intelligent creator. Or, yes, it's complex, but there are answers to it. I won't even say easy answers. There are answers to how it could have happened on its own. And it looks complex, but it merely looks that way. Really, there's an easy explanation for how we could have gotten there. That's going to be our two competing interests in all of this. And which is it? I want to quote from Sephen Hawking, and normally we only quote from Sephen Hawking in the realm of physics and things like that, but I want to quote from him on this topic from a Discovery Channel show that he did years ago. And I think that maybe is a wonderful example of how this whole concept is wrongfully presented to us. Sephen Hawking said, "Life is one of the strangest phenomena known. In my opinion, it shows that the universe is capable of almost anything." I want to stop for a minute. One of the dangers that we're going to run into is giving godlike powers to evolution or the universe or something else like that. We're going to read some quotes later on. We're going to read a quote that Charles Darwin himself quoted, talking about how he oftentimes did that. But I want you to notice how Sephen Hawking has just endowed the universe, which is not an intelligent being, with the power to create. So I'll start that over again, but I don't want you to miss that, because that is one of the things that we're going to find snuck into this discussion a little bit on the naturalist side of things. Life is one of the strangest phenomena known. In my opinion, it shows that the universe is capable of almost anything. Yet it amazes me that we know so much about how the universe began many billions of years ago, but we have yet to discover how life itself began. The most likely explanation, I want to pause again for 1 second. Okay, what we're looking for, because again, this is something none of us were there to witness. We don't have videotape evidence of it. We don't know exactly what happened. We're looking for the most likely explanation. So is Stephen Hawking correct that this is the most likely explanation? The most likely explanation is probably that we are an accident, just by chance, so luck. Some molecules bumped into each other at random, until finally one formed that could copy itself. Then began the slow process of evolution that led to all the extraordinary diversity of life on Earth. Life seems to be simply what matter does given the right conditions and enough time. That is an exceptional representation of the definition of naturalism as it relates to this topic. All you need is time and luck and a little bit of primordial soup, and everything else is just taken care of. The question we have to ask ourselves is Dr. Hawking correct? Is it really that easy? Or has he way overstated naturalism's case in all of this? And while a brilliant physicist, he is not a biologist, and while I'm not either, that statement of his is remarkably optimistic, and we're going to see how much so in the weeks to come. Darwin, and the way Darwin moved his theory forward, Charles Darwin was an amazing picture painter. He could do an incredible job painting a picture for you. If you've never read The Origin of Species, Darwin would paint these amazing pictures. He loved pigeons. There was a patch of dirt in his backyard that he was particularly fascinated with, but he loved talking about these things, but he could paint you a picture and present the argument in such a way that as the reader, you were kind of sucked into, well, I mean, if this happens and that, then I could maybe see how, all these things could come together. Let's read from Darwin himself and look at this topic of natural selection. So, which is the mechanism by which evolution is supposed to work. I want to read two quotes that kind of bring this together for us, but this is going to be what Darwin is after. And then we need to talk about what it means and what it doesn't mean. Okay? So again, this is quoting from The Origin of Species, Charles Darwin's book from 1859. As many more individuals of each species are born than can possibly survive, and as consequently there is a frequently recurring struggle for existence, it follows that any being, if it vary however slightly in any manner profitable to itself, that's key, under the complex and sometimes varying conditions of life, will have a better chance of surviving and thus be naturally selected. From the strong principles of inheritance, any selected variety will tend to propagate its new and modified form. So what he's saying, and a lot of times how this is presented to us, think about the example of a giraffe that we're oftentimes given. In a situation where there's limited food on the savanna, giraffes had an advantage because their long necks allowed them to reach up into the trees and eat leaves from the trees. And certainly an animal that had a little bit longer neck than its peers would have a better chance of survival. And so those particular groupings of giraffes and that group, that family, let's say, because that inherited trend from their ancestors of a slightly longer neck would tend to move forward into future generations, they would do better than other giraffes that had a shorter neck, and therefore they would survive while the others died out. And so through natural selection, what we ended up with is a giraffe with a very long neck rather than a horse, which has a very short neck in comparison, something like that. I want to jump a little further forward, and Darwin continues a few chapters later. Owing to this struggle, variations, however slight, and from whatever cause proceeding, if they be in any degree profitable to the individuals of a species, there it is again, if it's something that helps you, you're going to survive. If it's something that hurts you, you're not going to survive. If they be in any degree profitable to the individuals of a species in their infinitely complex relations to other organic beings and to their physical conditions of life, will tend to the preservation of such individuals and will generally be inherited by the offspring. I have called this principle by which each slight variation, if useful, is preserved by the term natural selection in order to mark its relation to man's power of selection. Okay. And what he means there is, let's say that we attempt to breed an animal. So we take a poodle and a golden retriever and we breed them together and we get a golden doodle. And so we have done that same thing by guided hand. He's saying nature does it through natural selection, through the process of survival of the fittest, and therefore we have evolution. Now, Darwin's point in all of this is if you hit the rewind button and you go all the way back from us, all the way back to the very beginning, somewhere at the very beginning was just as Sephen Hawking quoted. There were some molecules that bumped into each other. We got the first living cell that was able to replicate. And that first living cell is the common ancestor to everything, to plants, to mammals, to fish, to reptiles, to insects, you name it. Every living thing on this planet owes itself to that original, whatever it was. Whatever it was is a term that we'll see come back into play later on down the road, because of course no one knows. But that original molecule, that original cell that somehow was able to develop from primordial soup, we've been told. We'll talk a lot more about that down the road. But that initial cell is the common ancestor that all life shares. Now that's what is meant. But Darwin never went back that far. Darwin pointed generically in that direction and left it to the reader, partially because in 1859, they had no idea. They didn't know exactly what the cell was. They had no clue how complex it was. And they certainly couldn't go all the way back, and we can't either, to know what those initial conditions were like, although we can go much, much closer. Now, there's two different types of evolution that we're talking about here, and this is what's so important for us to consider as we go forward. Microevolution is taking a poodle and a golden retriever and making a golden doodle and going forward. And that's where Darwin made his argument, is around the idea of microevolution, that we could see changes within species, that we could look at these two different types of birds and we could see how one was able to thrive and survive and the other wasn't, or giraffes or other things that we've been shown and told how they could have evolved this way. That's the idea of microevolution. Microevolution is how do existing species change over time. Microevolution happens. We all know that it happens. We all have eyes to see it happening around us. So the idea that microevolution occurs, nobody questions that. So if you ask somebody, do you believe in evolution? You need to be very specific about what you mean. Do we all believe in microevolution? Well, of course, because we can see it. They've got 50 million kinds of doodles out there now. You know, I like some traditional dog breeds, but I'll admit a golden doodle is a cute dog. But we all see that going on around us. We're not talking about that. We're talking about macroevolution. To get all the way back to the beginning, does all life on this planet share a common ancestor that randomly was created, didn't evolve, evolve is not the right word there, that randomly jumped the gap between lifelessness and life. And from that initial ancestor, all life sprung. That's what we're talking about. So when you ask the question, do we all believe in evolution? Well, microevolution, the answer is yes. Macroevolution, the problem is, and I'm going to back this up in the weeks to come, but I'm going to make a bold statement here. The problem with macroevolution is there's no vehicle to support it. And we're going to run into so many deal breakers along the way. And this is not God of the gaps. That's not what we're doing. But what we are going to do as we walk forward through this is we're going to look at, again, all of these steps along the way that have to occur to get from nothing to us. And what I would encourage everybody to do, on the last episode, I asked the question, how does your worldview work? And if at every step in your worldview, you're kind of looking at it and you're having to plug in luck along the way, that's not much of a worldview. And I would encourage you in this process, if that's your answer to this, again, that is clearly Sephen Hawking's answer to this is luck. Charles Darwin's answer was luck. Richard Dawkins' answer is going to be luck, that we'll see in their quotes upcoming. And what we'll see in some steps along the way is luck is not even enough. You know, before I mentioned, you notice how Sephen Hawking snuck in a little bit of godlike powers to the universe, Charles Darwin was consistently accused of the same thing, so much so that in the book, The Origin of Species, one of the later editions, that's the copy that I have, he actually addressed that topic. I want to show you the quote, and I want to show you then why people said that. Charles Darwin, "It has been said that I speak of natural selection as an active power or deity. But who objects to an author speaking of the attraction of gravity as pulling the movements of the planets?" Okay, the reason why people accused him of that, let me go back into his book earlier and quote and show you why, or a little bit later on. "In living bodies, variation will cause the slight alterations. Generation will multiply them almost indefinitely, and natural selection will pick out with unerring skill each improvement." You just gave natural selection godlike powers right there. And that's going to be the problem. Natural selection is an unguided natural process. There can't be any guidance in all of this. So for our giraffe example, is it more likely or less likely that the longer neck feature is going to survive into the next generation? Well, it depends on a lot of different things. But as that giraffe moves from one generation to the next, does it make it more likely to survive than those giraffes who have shorter necks out on the savannah and can't reach food? Yes, it does. Right up until a lioness comes along and takes down the giraffe, and then the giraffe dies anyway, and it doesn't matter. So an incredibly wonderful skill that may have been there in the first place may have just been wiped out through the process of survival of the fittest, because even though you had a longer neck and you could get to more food, it only made you a fatter dinner option for a female lion out on the savannah who was hungry. So again, it's not just as simple as if these traits are positive, they'll just roll on forward. Not necessarily. From one generation to the next, you may have birth defects that cause things not to go. You may have other problems. There's lots of reasons why that wouldn't necessarily be the case. But what we see in this discussion is a tendency to give natural selection or evolution kind of godlike abilities. And that's where we're really going to look at this as we go down the road and go, all right, now wait a minute. Does it make sense that these things could happen? Again, Darwin paints a great picture, and it's our ability to see those instances of microevolution around us that allow us to go, well, if that could happen, then maybe macroevolution could happen too. And that's what we're going to look at in the weeks to come. It's not our ability to breed animals better in successive generations. Of course, we can do that. We do that very well. And it was our ability to do that that inspired Darwin in all of this, in that theory. And if all his theory referred to was microevolution, we could go, well, that's fine. But that doesn't explain where anything came from. And fundamentally, that is going to be one of the biggest problems that Darwin's going to have when we talk about macroevolution. So as we go forward, when I use the term evolution, I'm going to generally be referring to macroevolution, the idea that we all share a common ancestor, that from that one ancestor, all life has emerged to this point today. That's what we're going to be talking about. So that's our word of caution as we go forward. We're going to keep an eye on that as we move forward. And like I said, what you're going to find on so many stops along the way. When we asked this question, Sephen Hawking put forth, the most likely explanation was we're an accident. Is that right? That's what we're going to be looking for, is the most likely explanation. And I will tell you, I don't agree with Dr. Hawking. I think his philosophy is off on this one. Thank you so much for joining us this week. I think we're going to stop this week. Next week, we're going to talk about how this discussion is had and some of the problems that we see in it. And what are the steps along the journey that are coming up ahead of us. The list of things, the list of miracles that are going to have to occur to get us from lifelessness to life. There's not enough luck in the universe to get us there. So there's going to have to be a lot of naturalistic miracles along the way. And I know that's a contradiction in terms. How do we get from lifelessness to life? And that is something we will tackle in the weeks to come. Thank you so much for joining me this week. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. If you did, I hope you'll consider hitting the like button for this week's podcast and the subscribe button for the channel. You can find our podcasts on iTunes, Spotify, and of course here on YouTube. You can reach out to us at prooftograce.com on our website and via email at prooftograce@yahoo.com if you have any questions. Once again, thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye.